The early American settlers endured overwhelming hardships in this new land. 3 long months to travel across the ocean aboard the Mayflower, and a brutal winter left them hungry, vulnerable to disease, and very weary. Makeshift homes of branches and dried mud served as the only barrier between them and the harsh New England winter. Nearly half of the early settlers would succumb to death during the first winter in America. Because they were not yet familiar with their new environment, the gardens they planted were not productive enough to provide enough food for the winter. Every meal was measured out carefully. Would they be able to choose gratitude? Would they be able to trust that God was at work in their less than ideal circumstances? One Sunday morning, their church service was interrupted by a native chief who saw their plight and introduced them to a young Wampanoag Indian named Squanto. 12 years earlier, the Wampanoag Indians had been taken prisoner, transported to Spain, and sold into slavery by the English trader, Captain Hunt. Squanto was bought by a Spanish monk who treated him well and introduced him to Jesus. Eventually, Squanto wound up in England, working in the stable of a man named John Slaney, who promised to send Squanto back to America. In 1619, Squanto was homeward bound. His arrival home was met with the discovery that his entire village had been wiped out. Imagine how overwhelmed Squanto must have been, and the struggle of why God would allow him to return home, only to find everyone he had hoped to see dead. It was a little more than a year after his return home that Squanto was introduced to the overwhelmed early settlers on the very land where his village once stood. The governor of the early settlers, William Bradford, declared, "Squanto became a very special instrument sent of God for our good. He showed us how to plant corn, where to take fish, and to procure other commodities, and was also our pilot to bring us to unknown places for our profit, and never left us until he died." When that first full harvest yielded abundantly, Governor Bradford declared a day of feasting and thanksgiving. He invited the Indian chief to the feast, but the small group of settlers were overwhelmed when he showed up with 90 of his braves. There was not nearly enough food, and the early settlers had no idea how they would be able to feed their invited guests. Those guests did not arrive empty-handed. Instead, they arrived with 5 fully dressed deer and 12 plump wild turkeys. Found in the writings of the early settlers, a theme is found in the midst of the challenges. They were able to choose gratitude. This is an early Thanksgiving story, but in many ways, isn't it many of our stories as well? What if, like the early settlers, we were able to choose gratitude? Because whether we embrace it or not, God is at work in our circumstance to provide something for which we can all be thankful.